what we're going to talk about today is what we've learned by having the dictionary online and our experience, especially about language, but maybe if you want to be more technical, I can try that as well. And by the way, this image, this is the architect's drawing of the sculpture above the door of my office. And the sculpture is a life-size version in stone of the unabridged dictionary that was then current in 1940. If you know your editions, it's the famous Webster's Second, which was the largest mass-produced book in the history of American publishing, and it was the one that Funk and Wagnalls was trying to compete with, and they ultimately gave up. It was like an arms race, and they gave up. But that sculpture stands right above the front door, and I'm very proud of it. And so I always love that image, just a beginning. But what I like to start with is the history of English dictionaries. There have been dictionaries in English for 400 years. Around Shakespeare's time was the first monolingual dictionary of English. It was very small, but for 400 years, that also means that American dictionary publishers did not know what English language dictionary users were looking up. There was no possible way of knowing how the dictionaries were being used. There are some anecdotes. A famous one involves Samuel Johnson, Dr. Johnson here, who wrote the famous dictionary in London, 1755, in many ways the first modern dictionary of English. And he was congratulated on his publication by a lady of society in London who said, "I'm so pleased that you have omitted the naughty words." To which Dr. Johnson is said to have replied, "Madam, I find that you have been looking them up." And I cite this because it is true evidence of curiosity. It's clear we now know which words she was looking for in the dictionary. There's another anecdote that tells us a little bit more about curiosity and the way that dictionaries are used. This is James Murray, the first editor of the Oxford English Dictionary, another great tradition. And as you might guess, at Oxford, the faculty were consultants on the dictionary. And there was a new word submitted to the new, what was called at the time, the New English Dictionary. And it was a medical term. And so the question went to the medical faculty, should we add this word to the new Oxford English Dictionary? This is 1900, around 1900. And the answer came back, not at all. This word is too professional, too rare, too abstruse, too specific to be added to your dictionary. And I think for this room, we can understand that also represents a little prejudice of what a dictionary is. Is it only a literary or belletristic document, or is it also a catalog of the professional language of the world? In this case, this was viewed by the medical faculty as being their domain and their word, and not one for a general English dictionary. Then in 1901, the biggest news story of the new 20th century took place. The Queen died, which was Queen Victoria. And so her son was going to be crowned king, and the coronation was scheduled. And then unfortunately, the prince became ill. In fact, he became seriously ill. In fact, he became mortally ill. And he was so ill that the coronation was, in fact, postponed. And the entire country of Great Britain was obsessed with the health of the new king. And unfortunately, his condition was named by the word that was dropped by the editor of the dictionary. And it was not in the dictionary. They could not look the word up. And the word was appendicitis. He did survive, as you might know, which was his name. He was Edward the Seventh. Yeah. And that was appendicitis was often fatal at that time. If you were the King of England, you kind of got good treatment. But those two examples actually are incredibly precise examples about how dictionaries are used, the words that people look up. And in many ways, when we put our dictionary online in 1996, we learned some of these lessons, the same lessons that those anecdotes told us, except that they gave us data instead of anecdotes. I will give you a little bit of a brief history of our story. This is Noah Webster. He looks like money. Here. And Noah Webster is, of course, our namesake, and he did write the great American Dictionary in 1828. So we're approaching a bicentennial of the great Webster Dictionary. Webster was born in 1758, which means he turned 18 in 1776. And he was a very passionate revolutionary. He didn't quite fight in the American Revolution. He carried a musket to a battle that had already taken place. And by the time he arrived in Saratoga, if you've heard of that famous battle, which was won by the Americans, it was over and done. But we know that he tried, and he was going to fight for his country. And now Webster was a schoolmaster. He went to Yale. He wrote a great textbook for spelling, which is really the basis of his own personal fortune and fame. But then he made a dictionary in 1806, a very small dictionary, the first dictionary made in America, and that's the dictionary in which he changed the spellings that we are now familiar with. The changes that he made, including, for example, dropping the U, what he considered the French spelling, the U from words like honor and color and humor, and the RE for ER in words like center and theater. But then there are other changes, like he really had a thing against French spellings. The QUE spellings would change with a K. He didn't like silent letters. He didn't like double letters. Double letters in English are silent letters. So that's why in American English, you'll see terms like traveled with one L or canceled with one L as opposed to the British tradition. And so there are many of these changes that now all of these were variants that were kind of in the mix in early modern English. He's the one who established them as the standard for American English, and they are to this day. He thought he was simplifying English. Of course, he made it more complicated for all of us to now recognize two forms of English. And it's also important to recognize that as patriotic as he was, and that was part of the motivation, there was an etymological reason for many of these changes. Notably, the honor, color, humor, he would say, well, in Latin, those words were spelled without the U, and the U was introduced through French, and of course, English absorbed much of French, but all of those words go back to Latin. So he thought he was actually correcting English and not simplifying English, and that's an important point to make about Webster. Now, Webster's own, in 1828, he then made the big dictionary for which he's best known. It's entitled An American Dictionary of the English Language. It's important to note that Samuel Johnson's title was A Dictionary of the English Language. It was the first book in history with that as a title. And notice Webster only added the word American to Johnson's title. He very much wanted to be the American Johnson. In fact, Webster's dictionary appeared in 2 volumes, 2 large folio volumes like this, which is exactly what Johnson's dictionary looked like. It is interesting for me to think of that in the early 19th century, for Europeans, if you were in the French tradition, and the Académie Française had a dictionary, but also Furetière and Richelet, those large dictionaries were all presented in 2 large folios. So if you thought of a dictionary as an intellectual in the early 19th century, you thought of 2 big books. But then, unfortunately, Webster, who was a great scholar and great lexicographer in many ways, although there's a big asterisk to his scholarship that has to do specifically with Hebrew and Chaldee that we should talk about. It's a little bit of a digression, but we can talk about that later. But as a definer, he was without peer. He was excellent. However, he was not a good businessman. His dictionary cost $20 in 1828. $20 would be 2 months' wages if you worked on a farm. $20 would buy you what we call a grandfather clock, a framed clock like this. That's a 2-meter tall clock. Now, some furniture like this made in 1820s in Boston or Philadelphia could be worth $200,000, $250,000 today. That's not to say that his dictionaries are worth that much, but it shows you the relative value of these things. His book was a luxury item. It was not a household item. Then enter the printers, the smart guys. These are Charles and George Merriam. The Merriams were the printers in Springfield, Massachusetts. When Webster died, they swooped in and decided to try to make a better business for that dictionary. And you'll see at the top of this, their first advertisement, in 1847, they charged $6. So they brought the price way down. $6 was still a lot of money in 1847, but it's because of that decision that I have a job today. It's sort of the great American story of bring prices down and make your profits through volume. And what they did was they turned the dictionary into a household item, which is how we regard it today. They also, along the way, and it's just an interesting thing to contemplate in the modern world, they also created a brand. This was an exercise in branding. Webster was dead, but he was a famous name, and they continued the dictionary with his name. And that was a controversial thing even at the time. With the great revisions that took place later, Webster's own son approached the Merriams and said, "This is no longer my father's work. you should take his name off. And basically the answer was, well, we've made your mother rich, and it was easier to sell with an icon like Webster. And so in effect, they created a brand, they created a myth. And they also did something else, which is one of the reasons they could sell the book more cheaply, is that they retypeset the book in stereotype, and they set the pages very tight and very small print. And then they fit it all into one fat book. Now, that meant changing the model of an unabridged dictionary went from 2 volumes to 1 volume. And they didn't change the title. They couldn't change the title because of copyright. And so all they did was they stamped the word unabridged on the spine of the dictionary. That word had never been used for dictionaries before the Merriams did it. And they did it in order to confirm to the purchaser, to the customer, that this was in fact the whole dictionary in 1 volume. They also knew, as salesmen and as shipping, it's a lot easier to sell 1 thing than 2 things. And so it also helped create the market for themselves. But that's the 1847 edition with that word unabridged. They later made several revisions, and they changed the title when the copyright ran out for Webster's original title, and that started a whole wave of problems that to this day we do not hold a copyright on the name of Webster. However, paradoxically, if you know our branding, there's always a circle on our books. We actually have a trademark on the circle. And the circle started in 1890 with the edition that is called the International Edition. They changed the name to International for 2 reasons. One is that paradoxically, the dictionary sold very well in England. And that's because there was no one in England who did for Samuel Johnson what the Merriams did for Webster. No one took over the project and revised it on his behalf. So Johnson's dictionary had become a historical object and was no longer useful. In fact, the original idea for the Oxford English Dictionary was to begin with Johnson and revise Johnson. And they looked at it and they recognized it's too old. Too long, too many years had passed. And most people don't know this, but it's very well documented. The actual dictionary on the desks of the Oxford English Dictionary editors was the Merriam edition of Webster's dictionary, the 1864 edition, which was esteemed to be the most scientific and the most up-to-date dictionary in the English language, which it absolutely was at the time. But the circle starts in 1890. And then in 1898, they created a new thing, the Collegiate Dictionary. This is the best known one. You might know it as the Red Dictionary today. Whenever I give a talk in America to a group of people, especially in a library or of educators, I often will ask people if they had their own copy. If you're older than 50 years old, then you were given a copy of Webster's Collegiate Dictionary for graduation. And when I met Bill Clinton once, he said, I still have my copy of the Collegiate Dictionary that got me through Georgetown. And I knew what the answer would be, but I asked him, was it blue or red? Because we changed the color in 1973, and his was blue. It's from the 60s. But the 1898, this book cost $3. So the price comes down. The Collegiate also has its own kind of history. It's its own story. The Collegiate is the best-selling hardcover book in American publishing history after the Bible. It is also the standard publishing dictionary for the Chicago Manual of Style, that is to say for all books and magazines printed in America, for the Associated Press, that is to say for all newspapers printed in America, and for the MLA, the Modern Language Association, for all academic work. So the Collegiate Dictionary is the style book dictionary for American publishing. Then in 1947, we actually came out with the first paperback, the small paperback. You might know the story of the paperback begins with Penguin Publishing in Great Britain just before the war, 1938 or so. In 1947, just after the war, we created the first paperback. And this came out for 35 cents. It was 25 cents on sale. So at this point, distribution had been maximalized. We were selling dictionaries for 25 cents. There's only one place you can go after 25 cents for ultimate distribution, and that is free. So in 1996, the decision was made, and it was a controversial decision in-house, although many people, we look back on this as being important. At the time, it wasn't that important. This was the first homepage in 1996. Our president, now retired, who had been a lexicographer, so that's an important point too. The president of the company was himself an author of dictionaries, and it was his decision to make the dictionary available for free online. And that was a controversial, this was the best-selling hardcover book in American publishing, and he made it free. The sales staff were not happy. The executives above him, the board, were not happy. At the same time, the reason he was allowed to do it was because it wasn't viewed as being very important. The internet in 1996, there was no way to monetize it. There was no advertising. This is before eBay. This is before Google. God knows this is before Amazon. So that there was no actual way other than to view this other than as a new form of distribution or perhaps marketing. And so there was an online bookstore. And in fact, book sales went up for several years after this went online for free, possibly because if you used it in your office, you might remember that title when you went to shop. But what we learned was, once we put this dictionary up online, it was the collegiate dictionary, we could see for the first time which words people were looking up. And what that told us was immediately a couple of different stories. The first time we really noticed was one of the great first news stories that was widely shared online, the death of Princess Diana. And the static list of words that were mostly words of classical origin and words of abstract meaning. The top lookups on a daily basis would be words like integrity, ubiquitous, conundrum, paradigm. Those are the words that pay our salaries. Those are the words that send people to the dictionary. Notice that they all come from Greek or Latin. And that's exactly the way dictionaries work. However, in this case, we suddenly saw the words change. The list changed completely. And we had paparazzi, which was, of course, the cause, the immediate cause, the word princess and the word cortege. And now we're good at reading data. We're not good at reading minds. And paparazzi obviously was an important word that every newsroom in America was asking, how do you spell it? Are there two P's? Are there two R's? Are there two, they're all looking it up. The word cortege, of course, is pronounced in the French manner. It's also spelled in the French manner. So that's an awkward word for English speakers. Princess is a different story. Princess is not a difficult word to spell. It's not a particularly difficult word in anyone's vocabulary for an adult. And this is where we learned that one of the major drivers of traffic to our dictionary is encyclopedic information, not lexical information, not the spelling of this word, but maybe what is a princess? Are you born a princess? Is a princess automatically a future queen? Is a princess higher than a duchess? These are the kinds of questions that have nothing to do with the spelling of the word, nothing to do with its etymology, but everything to do with the way that the word works in the world. And that's what I would call encyclopedic information. If we have to make a definition for Cobb salad as opposed to Caesar salad, and you look at those definitions, the definitions are themselves sort of recipes, aren't they? Because we have to distinguish one from the other with the qualities that they share. The qualities of a Cobb salad, that it has chopped boiled egg, and bacon, are not germane to its lexical identity, but they have everything to do with its real identity. And so princess is one of those encyclopedic words that was searched. After 9/11, needless to say, we had a huge volume of traffic, and they tell a little story themselves. Concrete words of destruction like rubble and triage, more ideological words like terrorism and the response to terrorism, jingoism. And then finally, the more cultural responses that were not triggered by words used in the news, the words succumb and surreal. And this taught us something else. This is a chance for me as a lexicographer to say, I really hope with the word surreal in particular, which was the most looked up word after 9/11, after several weeks, I hope it's a good definition. I hope it's not a definition that reads something like of or relating to surrealism, one of those bad definitions. Turns out it's a very good definition, marked by the intense irrational reality of a dream. And that's a beautiful definition for a difficult word, because the word surreal actually does come from surrealism, from the art movement after Sigmund Freud, but after the 20th century, people like Dali and Magritte. But what was that art movement? It was the depiction of dreams, right? And so here you have a very well-crafted definition. I did not write this. This was written a generation ago. But using the word dream cues the idea of where this word comes from without being pedantic. But it was also an intense day. It was also an irrational day. And what does surreal mean? The sur above the real. It's more than real. It's extra real. It's too real. And so this is a terrific definition for someone to land on in a moment of distress. And it turns out that this is the word that Americans look up in moments of distress. The most looked up word after 9/11, the most looked up word after the bombings of the Boston Marathon, the most looked up word after Robin Williams' suicide, and the most looked up word after the election of Donald Trump. I'm not joking. Michael Jackson's story was actually, in terms of traffic, in terms of raw numbers, more people looked up words after Michael Jackson's death than after 9/11. And I won't spend much time with this, except to note that they tell a story also. And the last word, emaciated, was the reported condition of his body. And this is another very important reason that we find over and over for people to look up words in the dictionary. A word like emaciated is pretty well known in medical terms. But it's usually used in as regards starvation in the developing world. It's never used regarding the most famous pop star in the world. So there was a cognitive dissonance with the medical use of this term. Whenever we see a word that has a narrower use that is very specific in medical and especially legal or scientific senses, that word gets looked up. And it could be a word, a very basic word about the moon, but if there's a scientific event, then people look up that word. By the way, that ended up being the second most looked up word of the year of 2009. It was a massively important word for our data. Now, politics are obviously a big part of American public life, and the dictionary online has become a kind of public utility. It's something that people look to, and we can trace that in many ways. I remember where I was in a hotel in Los Angeles when Bernie Sanders, the American politician, declared his candidacy. It was unimaginable in my own youth to have an American presidential candidate identify himself as a socialist. That was a word that could not be used. So that was a kind of change that we could see in real time. And by the way, I put these things up. This is from when Twitter was good, and it was a useful public utility as well. And the word fact was the most looked up word in the early days of the first Trump administration, when one of his aides said, used the term alternative facts. And so in the face of alternative facts and fake news, what we find is the dictionary becomes a neutral and objective arbiter of truth, because ultimately there has to be a backstop of meaning. The dictionary cannot be perceived as a political document. It is often perceived that way. We are often accused that way. Our offices were closed because of bomb threats by the FBI not very long ago, because of our entries regarding transgender identity. But we had similar threats after updating the definition for the word vaccine to make it more scientifically appropriate with the new mRNA kinds of vaccines. So all we did was our lexical job, and we were threatened with, very, very, very vivid depictions of a machine gun walking through our corridors. He was arrested and is in jail now. And then what we found after the Charlottesville riots, you could see what people were thinking about by looking at our dictionary's data: fascism, bigot, racism, complicit, neo-Nazi, and nationalism. And just as an example, when Henry Kissinger died, the word notorious was the top lookup. And so what you can realize is the way the public perception of a given story or of a given figure are often driven by news accounts. And a term like icon for Michael Jackson, icon was used in most of the obituaries. But you can forget all of that. English is a difficult language. These are among the most looked up words in our dictionary. It is an unusual thing, especially as someone who speaks a Romance language. For people who learn English through a Romance language in particular, there's no difficulty whatsoever in using these words. But English speakers cannot tell them apart. And there's a big problem, and I give entire lectures just on the use of these words for teachers of English. But needless to say, they are usually pronounced the same way, and that's part of the problem in English. They both happen to be verbs and they both happen to be nouns, although one is much more often used as a verb and one much more often used as a noun. But the dictionary is a resource for the English language. And as I said before, these are the kind of evergreen terms that are looked up day in, day out, year in, year out. Notice that they are mostly abstract terms, and abstract terms are difficult to define. Terms like integrity and insidious. And the last several months, I did another sort of survey. These are this and the next slide are the most looked up words today on a daily basis. Democracy, woke, fascism, environment, justice, empathy, but also aesthetic, serendipity, metaphor, cisgender, gaslighting, and love. These are among the most looked up words on a daily basis that have nothing to do with the news. Now, there is an asterisk there. Some of these lookups are artifacts of our website. One of the most looked up words in the dictionary is the word dictionary. They come to the box and they key in the word dictionary, looking for the dictionary. They don't know they're already there. And so people looking up the word dictionary are paying us lots and lots of money. But they also look up, now we recently added a feature to our definitions that cross-checks the parts of speech, so that if you land on affect, and you want to look up the noun, you might click on noun and it'll get you to the entry for noun. And so the grammatical terms like adjective, pronoun, and noun, those are artifacts of our own cross-referencing within the environment of the dictionary. But it's something that people so far at least haven't complained about, and it's giving us more traffic. Now, there are sometimes some terms are looked up because of the news. Some terms are looked up because of the calendar. In the month of February, the #1 most looked up word for the first 2 weeks of February is the word love. And I don't think it's for spelling. But once again, we always say we're good at reading data, not at reading minds. We do have some evidence about the curiosity for this word. And we get a lot of, you might imagine, we get a lot of correspondence, a lot of letters. And we used to answer every single letter. I answered many, many, many letters before the internet. And now we get them mostly as email. But here's the answer to a letter. We thank you for your letter. Your question about how long love lasts is not something we can answer. We lexicographers are good at defining words. Questions about the nature and permanence of deeply felt human emotions are a little outside our field. We're sorry not to be more helpful. Now, it is funny, but it's also completely earnest, and that's something I love about my job and especially about Merriam-Webster. We're very earnest. And in fact, Steve, you notice, by the way, this letter was written 2 weeks before my first day at Merriam-Webster. And Stephen Peralt later was promoted. He became the second director of defining. That was his title, director of defining at Merriam-Webster. Very important editor, now retired. But it's clear that this letter was about the phenomenon of love and not the lexicon of love. And so that's an important distinction that we have to draw. We are not doing real defining. We are doing lexical defining. We are defining the word and the company it keeps on the page. That is not defining. We can never tell someone what they feel or what they think. And so that's a narrow and philosophical division. When I explain the difference between encyclopedic and lexical defining, I sometimes use examples like, for example, the reason in the earlier editions we had all the gods of Greek and Roman myth, for example, all the characters in Shakespeare. But in fact, those are not really words, right? They're just names of characters. And so we draw the line right between the word Romeo and the word Hamlet. Because if you can use the term in a generic way, he's a real Romeo, and it's understood that you're referring to a young, attractive male lover, then that's a generic term. That's a lexical term. But if it's the name of a character and only the name of a character, then it doesn't get entered in the dictionary. So we do enter Romeo, we don't enter Hamlet. Actually, in our largest older editions, we do enter Hamlet as an indecisive person. Now, in terms of, now where does that go? Oh yes, now part of the schedule, the annual schedule, and a big part of our work life is back to school. In September, we see these words looked up. And some of them, like science and culture, are very general words, which if you're 18 years old and you arrive on a college campus, suddenly the word culture feels very specific. You take a class called Culture Through Film. And you realize that culture is such an important, but it's also such a broad term. And it's also incredibly abstract. But also you see terms like aptitude and plagiarism that are in every college orientation. They're hearing the word plagiarism and they're all looking it up. Now, there are other terms from the calendar, like Christmas time. We always see these terms looked up, like Noel and Yuletide. And at Thanksgiving in America, the words cornucopia and feasts, things like that. But also at Thanksgiving, we see something else, 2-letter words that are looked up. And what you have on Thanksgiving and Christmas is no academic traffic, no business traffic. And what you find is in homes all over America, people are playing Scrabble. And so initially, we saw these spikes happen about 11 o'clock at night. And I realized in ballrooms and bedrooms around America, people are playing Scrabble. So we can actually tell when Scrabble is being played. And actually, this is something else I do have a slide for, I'll get to in a minute. And we no longer divide, for reasons that are too complicated to explain, for a long time, we had 2 sets of data. One was for the mobile data and one was for the website data. And I can tell you that people who use their dictionary on their phones look up many, many more dirty words than they do on the dictionaries on their laptops. Now, 2020, another thing that we measure with our data is the most looked up word of any given year. Needless to say, 2020 began with the term impeachment, which it's hard to remember, but that was going to be the story of the decade. It turns out that within a few weeks of the impeachment, which was, of course, ended up with an acquittal, we had the pandemic. And this is the first time in 20 years of looking at this data where every single word in the top 50 related to the same story. And if you look at these words, they connect to this medical specificity, but also legal specificity, and cultural ideas, like Kafkaesque. And to me, the most poignant of all of these is the word cancel. Because you might recall, and I certainly do, there were lots of handwritten signs in the windows of businesses and people who would make announcements on Facebook or online, events that were canceled. And the big question was simply, is there one L or two? And so, in other words, they're using the dictionary for its very basic mechanical function. How do you spell the damn word? But other terms like coronavirus, which of course was already in the dictionary, coronavirus, which was coined in 1968, was added to our dictionary in the 1980s. We added and changed that definition, and we added something else. These are the most looked up terms for that period, including the term hoax. And again, it's easy to forget, you know, what went on. But then we had an unscheduled update. We used to have updates, a new printing every year, but it would take a lot of preparation because, among other things, you had to change the plates. We still call them plate changes in-house to change a definition. It's a plate change. And I have this in my office. I actually have the copper plate from this page of the 1934 edition. The copper plate weighs 6 pounds. The edition had 3,000 pages. So you can imagine how big the storage had to be for the printing plates. But in today's dictionary, we can, of course, update instantaneously online. And we did. We added the term COVID-19. We updated the entries for coronavirus and social distancing. And we added terms like self-quarantine, which suddenly became very important. Contact tracing. But COVID-19 had been coined by the World Health Organization 34 days before we added our entry to the dictionary. By far the fastest any term has ever entered our dictionary. And the moment it went live, it spiked. It was getting looked up thousands of times per hour immediately. And that shows us, our data also shows us what our unsuccessful lookups are. So we knew that there was a demand for this entry. And you also recognize from those words that the public utility of the dictionary in times of national stress, that there is a kind of comfort in the knowledge that is represented, and especially in the constancy that's represented in the dictionary. The fastest word that ever entered our dictionary before COVID-19 took 2 years from its coinage to its entry, and that's because of the publication process, and that word was AIDS. No surprise that year, you don't have to guess, just because we're all linguists here, we can talk about the etymologies of these terms of pandemic, all of the people. Endemic means among the people, epidemic, upon the people, pandemic, all the people. That's just because we're word nerds here. That has nothing to do with data. But 2021, again, it started with what we thought was going to be the big story of the year. There was an actual there was actual treason on television. But in fact, the big story of the year was vaccine. But this was really two stories. There was the medical story, but there was the much, much more difficult political story. Can the government make you take a vaccine? Can the school system make you take a vaccine? Can your child go to school without a vaccine? That political story of vaccine was every bit as important as the medical one, as the scientific one. But because we changed and altered our definition to add the mRNA kind of virus, because the previous definition of vaccine really depended on the older model of a viral taken from cows, we were accused of being an arm of the government and of committing a kind of propaganda. And that also gave us a lot of violent accusations. Gaslighting, a more recent term and a hugely successful word of the year. Word of the year of 2023 was authentic. And it's interesting to me that the word authentic connects. In that year, we heard about AI and especially deep fakes on a weekly basis. There's a new story about AI. Now, of course, we're sort of starting to assimilate with artificial intelligence. But I submit that when authenticity is put into question, we value it more. And so this is a word that suddenly meant something much more specific. Another function of the internet is that these word games like Wordle and Quordle have driven a huge amount of traffic to the dictionary. And there were days when we would have, in the top lookups, the people looking for the answer of that day's Wordle. Some people would say, I don't want to go to the dictionary because it'll give me a clue And some days what we've tried to do is suppress these terms, and it becomes kind of a game. And as you might know, if you go to merriam-webster.com, there are a number of word games that are our own that many people play. And I'm thrilled to death. I don't play them at all, but I'm thrilled to death that people play word games and that they love them. And I'm going to kind of end with a few of these most recent, the most recent data. If you look at our homepage, we display every 30 seconds a new list of words, which are the top words being looked up during that 30 seconds. And you can see on January 20th, the inauguration day of this year, oligarchy, fascism, pardon, MAGA, gender, oligarch, abbreviation, which may relate to the term MAGA. I'm not sure why it was looked up. Woke, and I don't know where logical comes from, but there's an unusual case of 10 words, almost all of them connected to the news of that day. And what's interesting to me is, again, when Twitter was good, I would report, for example, before a presidential debate, the word debate itself would spike, as would the word moderator. And then there would always be someone who says, well, no wonder Americans are so stupid, they have to look up the word debate in the dictionary. And I always answer with something like this, that looking up a word in the dictionary is a confirmation, or looking for nuance, looking for etymology. With debate, you have encyclopedic questions. Is a debate only between two people? Can there only be one moderator? Does the moderator have to be a neutral person? Can there be multiple moderators? And so there are questions about debates and moderators that can be answered through the dictionary definition. But my point is, it gives us a clue about what people are thinking about in the moment. Our editor in the 1950s, who made the famous Webster's Third, which was regarded as being a kind of radical document, it was considered to be the radically descriptive dictionary. And the term descriptivist is one that we hear that's sort of thrown at us as an accusation. It's one that we wear as a badge of honor. Descriptivism versus prescriptivism is, I think, kind of a straw man, simplified argument about how lexicography works, about what dictionaries do. But there's no question about how we do our research, and that is strictly descriptive. And the prescriptive elements that we inherited from the 19th century dictionary tradition are ones that we have happily thrown away. And that same goes for grammar. There's a kind of prescriptive grammar and there's a kind of descriptive grammar. And the fact is, none of this is valid or useful to us today. And the dictionary serves a prescriptive function. Of course, you look it up for spelling, you look it up for conventional meaning, but its research is descriptive, and I try to make that clear. I love this picture. This girl is now 30, I think, by the way. But I thought I would just kind of conclude with a little remark on the fact that this journey of putting the dictionary online has changed the way we work, because now we know which words people are looking up. We pay more attention to those definitions. A word like socialism, we discovered, was still an absolutely 1960s based Cold War version of socialism. There was not in 2015 when I tweeted that, we did not have a definition for the kind of government that you find in Canada or Denmark. We did not have a definition for what we might call democratic socialism. So we recognized that there was something we had to revise. We had to catch up. So now the public tells us what words they're interested in, and the top 10,000 entries in terms of volume of traffic are among the most researched and revised entries. We make sure that they're current. Now, another thing that interests me are, what are the last 10,000 entries? And those are words that are looked up maybe once every 10 years. And that's interesting too, and I have to look into that. But what we did learn was, through putting the dictionary online, we now have a very specific story about the nuanced way that people use the dictionary. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Questions? He said 40 minutes and you were on the minute. We have plenty of time for questions and comments. Yeah, please. Oh, yeah.
Yes, very good question. Slang and form, I mean, to me, there are two kinds of facts in a dictionary. There's the linguistic fact, which is easy to prove. You know, the conventional spellings, conventional phonetics usually are easy to prove, conventional meaning. But then there's the cultural fact. And what dictionary editors call usage is what I think is the manners of language. An important function of the dictionary is to avoid giving offense to others and embarrassing yourself. And so that's why we have to put a label like offensive or obscene or British or or Southern. But that editor that I showed you, Philip Gove, one of the changes he made that was highly criticized at the time is we formerly had several different labels. We had the label colloquial, and we also had the label slang. And I have seen his memo from 1955, and he said, I don't know a damn person who can tell you the difference. So why do we have both? So he removed the label colloquial. They're all slang now. So in that kind of simplification, but also he determined, and this was also controversial, that actually the best way to know how a word is used is to show its use, is to show what we call a verbal illustration, an example sentence. He was also highly criticized for that because people expected to see Milton and Shakespeare and Spenser quoted in the dictionary. And instead, he did quote them, but he also quoted people like Ethel Merman and Betty Grable, and people who in mid-century America were very famous, but who were not scholarly, shall we say. But the Ethel Merman quote in our Unabridged Dictionary, which I believe is still there, was at the entry for the verb drain. And the quote was, 3 shows a day drain a girl. And that's a very specific, very kind of New York, Broadway kind of talk. It means it exhausts you. It makes you tired. And so that's a terrific entry in the dictionary. However, that use of drain, I don't think has a slang label because he didn't find, there's no possible way of giving offense with that. And it's also very specific to her field. So it might be argot, it might be jargon, but it's not slang. So we do have several different ways. Now, we give the label or we give a note, and often there's an actual long explanation. And for some terms, we actually, if you look up some terms in our dictionary, we'll have an explanation at the N word, for example. It actually says, this is among the most offensive words in the English language. And we make sure that that's very plainly stated. But some terms are only used in baseball. And so, yeah, we have the label baseball, because you don't need to know what a designated hitter is or, an infield run. An infield fly, I should say. But at the same time, they have to be there. One of his other rules was to save space. Everything was about saving space, was that we could not enter self-evident compounds. So in our print dictionaries, there is no entry for orange juice, for example, because it's the juice of an orange. You could derive it. So there's no entry for cattle ranch, but there is an entry for dude ranch. Because you have to explain what it is, right? There's no. So I recently wrote the definition for dad joke. Because dad joke is a very specific thing that is not actually the consequence of a joke and a dad. You have to understand, and that's also, it brings us to a grammatical thing. For saving space, every noun, English is just peculiar. Every noun can modify another noun, and so we have categories of words. Office building, coffee table, wine glass. I mean, in every case, there's nothing lexical about the wine of wine glass that is different from wine the noun, except here it's functioning as an adjective, right? So Philip Gove, the same editor, he invented a new term, and the term is attributive noun. An attributive noun is one that gives its attributes to another noun. And as it happens, and that saves us from writing 2 definitions. That means the definition for the noun stands for its modifying function. And so the dictionary does, and another innovation that he made, and this is because you're a linguist, that we were criticized for, was he enforced every definition had to be written in the part of speech of the head word. So every verb in a Merriam-Webster dictionary begins with the particle to. Because it's a verb. And every noun has to have a genus term. So grass begins, the first word has to be a plant. And then you distinguish the plant. And he limited the number of modifiers. You could have no more, according to his rule, than 4 modifiers before a genus term. So a solid herbivorous ungulate, solid herbivorous ungulate, four-legged mammal. A large solid-hoofed herbivorous ungulate mammal. So there we go. And that's a horse. So he created a set of rules, kind of legalistic rules by which we write all the definitions. And that does allow a kind of scientific vocabulary to form. But for formal language, we will simply identify the field. If it's psychology, for example, or if it's a literary term of literary criticism, we just use those labels as much as possible. But the real test is the example sentence. And that will show you the context, the friends that it keeps, the company that it keeps. What was your other question? Oh, etymology. We do. I'm deeply thrilled to say we do have, I think, the greatest etymologist working in the English language. Unfortunately, he's getting older, but he's doing a lot of great work. He can't do the whole thing, but yes, we're doing lots of. If you notice online, our etymologies now are much longer because he has the space. The etymologies that Webster made were very faulty. Because of religion. He referred to himself as a born-again Christian, and that was with the Second Great Awakening of a big piece of American history, and he believed in the literal truth of the Old Testament. And so therefore, Adam and Eve were the first speakers of language, and therefore English derived from their language. And so that results, if you look at a copy of a pre-1864 Webster dictionary, there is Hebrew, there's Arabic, there is what he called Ethiopic and Chaldee, and ridiculous characters that no one could possibly read in New England. But he was sure because of phonetic resemblances. So he did his etymologies phonetically. They were quietly removed. Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, location data and the trends, that's tricky. Yes, it can be possible. It's hard. I used to manipulate the data a lot. It's very heavy. There's so much of it that it can be hard to do. But yes, we can say, and we have said in the past, well, the most looked up word per state, for example. It's usually not that interesting and it's not that important for us, but there is a possibility to know, if it's abroad or if it's domestic. Most of our traffic is domestic and most of it is general. So we don't do much with it, but it is possible. I'm not a programmer, thank God. It's just too much. It's just too much. Yes. Well, there's never been an academy in the English language, and that was, as you probably know, proposed often in the Enlightenment in Johnson's lifetime. Jonathan Swift was a great proponent, and they basically said, "Hey, if France has one, we should have one too." It's just interesting to me that England has no written constitution, and that the basis of English law is common law, which is to say precedent. And so therefore the basis of English lexicography is also precedent. It's also the Merriam tradition, the Webster tradition has always been a synchronic tradition. I always say the current active vocabulary of American English is our actual job. And so, to the extent that Merriam-Webster is the largest, the oldest, and today the only publisher of dictionaries in America, we do sort of serve as an arbiter, like if an academy is the Supreme Court of language, people do treat us that way in some regards. We don't promote that idea. But there are events like the National Spelling Bee where I'm a judge, and clearly the authority is the dictionary. You're either right or you're wrong, and it's according to the dictionary. And that is a very prescriptive role. It's a very literally judgmental role. And if for example, the young person spells a word, if we give a variation of the word in boldface letters, if we also give it, even if that's not the primary variant, if the speller uses it and we publish it, it's still correct. So literally the black and white of our dictionary is the correct or incorrect answer for the National Spelling Bee. So, the idea of a national academy, I understand why it and how. It's always the most inefficient possible way. The French Academy Dictionary, as you probably know, is always been a kind of very inferior product. It was never the authoritative dictionary. And it is funny that even to this day, very often in the American press, people will say, well, at least the French have the academy to tell people what's right and wrong. The French Academy can't give you a parking ticket for misspelling a word or for using t-shirt in English or something. So they have no authority. They have no real authority. They have a symbolic authority. And the Académie Française today is a kind of reward for a career's work in the humanities. That has nothing to do, none of them are lexicographers, none of them are linguists. And I'm now, as of today, the only person I know who's had a tour of the Académie Française, the Oxford English Dictionary Archives, and the Hebrew Academy. But I love the fact that to me, the Académie Française it shows the importance of the language in their culture. That they also have, they have legal status for their language, which English does not in America we'll see. Up till recently, it's sort of a shock to hear, but in France, it is a different thing, being the language of lingua franca, the new lingua franca of the internet, for example, and certainly of business. We're not in the same position of France, which in France you have le droit au français. I think it's the way it's so that if you have a medical emergency, if you're going to the hospital or a legal situation, it's actually inscribed in law that a plain French version will be given to you. In America, there is no such thing. There is no such tradition, but it's always been the tradition to offer plain Spanish translations, for example, in hospitals and courtrooms, and that's always just sort of made sense. I don't think that's going to change very soon, by the way, because the recent pronouncements of Donald Trump up for a nationalized language, which is something that, frankly, racists have said since the beginning of the country, that has no legal power. I mean, he hasn't changed the law, and the law states that translations need to be provided for people who are citizens in need. So for now, it's okay. It just shows his kind of intent. But no, I don't think we need an academy, and it's just a curious thing that Italy has an academy, Spain, France, but England and English never have, and I think it's probably just for the best that we'll let it go. We'll let it go. Yeah. Yes. You can. Well, I mean, yeah. So first of all, in terms of frequency, there isn't a hard number. And if a word is frequently used, it's going into our dictionary. It's just a question of when. And if it's used in large publications, if a word is found in the New York Times, a word like COVID-19, there was no argument about, of course. But if a word is used frequently in many different publications, it's going to go in the dictionary. It's just a matter of time and our labor and how important the term is. I mean, I just drafted an entry for orange wine. Do you know what orange wine is? So orange wine is not the wine of an orange. And so therefore it needs a definition. And I noticed I was in a restaurant in Jerusalem last night, and on the menu, there was a category for white, sparkling, rosé, orange, and red. So when it gets to that point, when I'm sitting in a restaurant and that's a category, so orange wine is white wine made like red wine. In other words, they leave the skins in the vat, and then some of the color from the skins just seeps in. So it looks a little pink or orange, and so it has to do with the color of it. And it's assumed that is the ancient way that, like in Georgia, in Central Europe, that the first wines were made in kind of ancient Rome, that they probably didn't separate the white skins out, which is the French tradition, to keep the wine very kind of bright and clear. So it's cloudy white wine, is basically what it is. And it has an association with kind of organic wines. So in terms of appropriateness, yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount of prejudice in old editions of dictionaries. If you're looking for offense in a dictionary, you will find it. But I can tell you in old editions of our dictionaries, especially in names of ethnicities, I have found entries that say, a North African tribe of low culture, and there was one, they are a deceitful people. I mean, those are terms that are taken from our own. So that is a kind of judgment that is extra lexical, first of all. That's right. Oh, no, and that's a very important point. If the term is used in Shakespeare, for example, and is still studied and still read, then it'll be labeled archaic, and it might be a note that says this was formerly. We use the term formerly in the defining text in those cases, formerly used for X or Y or Z. But there are other things that are more subtle, like the fact that there were many more verbal, example sentences with masculine actors than with feminine, and there are many more feminine ones that were in domestic roles or secretarial roles, and we have absolutely kind of we've tried to regulate and normalize that, and that's I don't know if that's fashion so much as justice, and we're just trying to remove as much prejudice, social prejudice, as we can from the dictionary. It's never really possible, but it is true. You will find, if you look in Johnson's dictionary, all of his prejudices, including the fact that he, for example, hated Americans. Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. Right. The only answer is empirical. So for example, when the New York Times started printing LOL, then clearly, and that's in our dictionary now. So, but if you're texting a kind of abbreviation that might be personalized or might be not published, if we don't have published evidence for it, we don't have evidence for it. You know, I mean, we always, the gold standard was always printed evidence, you know, published evidence. And my boss used to say, what was the term of art? Carefully edited prose. That was that carefully edited prose, which means the New Yorker magazine, the Atlantic, you know, the kind of good, because, you know, if it's used in those places, we know it's solid. Now, for a lot of social media, it's not published. I mean, it is visible, but it's not published. We do take evidence from used to be Twitter and Facebook, but we can't take only that. In other words, if something has to have absorbed through an editorial process and be determined to be understandable to a wide enough readership for us to, because we're still a general dictionary. We're not trying to be a dictionary for the internet. We're not trying to be a dictionary for texting. There are such things. That's not us. And what we found is if a texting substitution or abbreviation, for example, has passed into the general culture to the point where you see it on bumper stickers or in the newspaper, yeah, okay, it's a lexicalized item. We'll add it to the dictionary. But that's not so much judgment as again, evidence. If we have evidence of its use, we'll put it in. So the political delicacy is, for example, because people like guns in America, they don't like our definition of assault rifle because we define it as both an automatic, fully automatic, and a semi-automatic weapon that made to resemble or that resembles a military weapon, or that is often used for. And there are a lot of people who advocate for the private ownership of such weapons. They wish we would take the word automatic out of that, because then they could point to the dictionary in a legal situation and say, see, what I have here, which looks like an army gun, isn't an army gun. But we don't enter into that debate at all. What we can say is, in the printed evidence, this term, assault rifle, is frequently used for both. And so it's not a legal decision, it's a lexical decision. We simply, that word is used to mean these two things, and that's it, you know. So the danger is only in not doing enough research and not doing enough evidence. And I mean, terms like racism, which have a systemic element that is the term systemic didn't exist when we added the word racism, but now it does. And so, and the term systemic entered through anthropology and through, you know, but now it's a term that we all are familiar with. So now if you look up the word racism, the term is defined according to a kind of systemic model. That wasn't true 50 years ago, but you know, times change, and the way that we label our culture changes. So we have to keep up. It's revision, and the revision has to be empirical, or else we don't have the authority that people impute to us. I hope that answers.